Setting up your meeting for Facebook Live. Let me know if you see something, Jana.
I think you're coming on.
Okay.
Yes, I think you're coming. Yep, there you are.
All right. Hey, everybody. I think we're live on Facebook.
Charlie. There's
Okay. So this is brand new for everybody here. It's brand new for all of us. But welcome to our Wednesday night Bible study, our Wednesday night adult class that we're now doing via Zoom for the Danville Church of Christ. For those of you that are still trying to tune in and you've plugged into Facebook, we'd encourage you to jump onto Zoom and join us. And if you need me to send you the IP address, I'd be happy to do that. We got people jumping on right now. Not sure who this is, but we're about to find out. And so we are starting. This is our very first class that we are doing. And it looks like everyone's muting themselves. Let's find out who else is jumping in here. iPad 2. Welcome to whoever just joined us. Let's see here. I don't got any video yet. Anyhow, we'll find out in a minute. But we're excited to get this started. We are starting a series in the book of James. So we are going to be going through the book of James together. And of course, we're going to start in James chapter 1 tonight. And we'd encourage you, as you're following along on Facebook, even if you're not participating in Zoom, we'd encourage you to make comments on the video, the live video that's on Facebook. And I will be watching that closely. And we will be sure to address your comments or your questions during the class tonight. And so thank you guys so much for tuning in and joining us. And before we get started in our discussion here, we always want to begin a study like this with prayer. And so, Charlie, could I get you to unmute yourself and lead us in a prayer to start our class tonight?
Sure. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for a beautiful day. We're grateful for all you provide, and we're grateful for time together here in this manner to get to study, dear Father, and this midweek time to look at your word and increase their faith. You've promised us that if we'll keep our hearts open and ears open and hear your word, our faith will grow. We pray for that tonight, especially in our study of James and how we can do better for you and do better for others. We thank you for your son, Jesus. Be with BJ tonight as he directs our thoughts. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Charlie. I appreciate that. So as we start this study in James, for those of you that are going to be joining us on a regular basis, how we're going to outline this class is we're going to be basically looking at James through the lens of faith, living faith versus dead faith. Because that is very frequently how James is going to depict things within his letter, and it can really be outlined like that. The very first part of his letter that we're going to get into tonight is going to be discussing how living faith is tested by trials. And then we'll go through the rest of the book, and he's going to discuss how living faith is evidenced by work, and that it is exercised by our conduct and different things like that. So we're going to look through James through that lens together as we start this study and start this discussion. Let's go ahead and open up our Bibles to James. And Diane Estes is joining in. I'm going to keep trying to get as many people in here as possible. So if I don't click on you right away, I'm multitasking, so bear with me. But let's go ahead and jump into our text. We are in the book of James, chapter 1 and in verse 1. And tonight we're going to try to get through verse 18 if we can. Hey, Mike. Hey, Diane. Welcome to the stream.
Hola.
All right. James chapter 1 and verse 1 says, James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, greetings. So as we get into this, of course, James is traditionally recognized, and we don't need to get into a ton of authorship stuff tonight. We got more important stuff to talk about, but James is traditionally recognized as the brother of Jesus. And so it's interesting that he begins this letter addressing himself as the servant of the Lord Jesus, of course, which he was. But he did not claim, the family special or address himself as the brother of Jesus. He simply calls himself what he is, and that is a servant of Jesus. But what's really interesting, and this is actually going to set us up for what we want to talk about tonight. And what we want to talk about tonight is James is going to begin this very first section. And when we focus on living faith, James is going to be really focusing on our faith being tested by trials. And we're going to see a setup for that in the way that James actually begins his letter. And so I want to open this up for some discussion as we read just this very first verse, because you've probably recognized that James addresses the beginning of his letter like Peter does in his first letter, but it's different from many other books of the New Testament. And he addresses it to the dispersion. Here, James, oh goodness, Mike and Diane are playing with their backgrounds here, sorry. But James addresses the beginning of this book to the 12 tribes in dispersion. So I'm going to open it up for discussion here within our Zoom chat. So go ahead and unmute yourselves if you have something to contribute. But I just want to ask that question to begin with. Why does he reference the 12 tribes of Israel who are in dispersion? Who is he writing to? Are these lost tribes? What kind of people is James addressing here? And so what have you guys got? Why does he say this?
I was thinking, BJ, that probably Christians, my brethren, second verse, he is calling them my brethren, and those that would have been of the Jewish ethnic background, that are not maybe outside of Jerusalem, but outside of where you would think of the group of Jewish faith, but maybe Jewish Christians who are abroad.
Okay, very good. I think that's exactly right. Randy, did you have something you wanted to throw in there?
Yeah, Charlie's right. I think, anytime you see the reference of 12 tribes, you automatically think of the descendants of Jacob and the patriarchs as they pass down through Israel's history in a biological sense, in a physical sense. But the connection here is also with the spiritual sense, and that's what James is tying into. These Jewish Christians would understand completely what he's talking about. And we do too, from a physical Israel to the spiritual Israel today, which is the church.
Right. And those are passages that we see in Romans 9. We read the following, starting in verse 6. It says, "But it is not as though the word of God has failed, for not all who are descended from Israel are Israel. Neither are all children because they are Abraham's descendants. On the contrary, in Isaac your seed will be called. That is, it is not the children of physical descent who are God's children, but the children of promise who are considered seed." And you see this really fleshed out by Paul in Galatians chapter 3, who James is writing to as he calls on the 12 tribes, as he's talking about the true people of Israel. These would have been the people of God who were of Abraham's seed by faith, those who were in Christ. And the reason he calls them the dispersion is because, of course, we know that this is talking about the church. This is talking about Christians who had, because of persecution, gone away from where the church had originated, from Jerusalem. And that's going to make everything here so much more personal. Because remember, where is James located? And every time we pick up the book of Acts, where is James writing from? But he's in the city of Jerusalem, right? And that's where Peter would have been. And so when you look at Peter's book, how he begins it, and when you look at James's book and how James begins this letter, both of them would have been a huge part of the start of the church in Jerusalem. They would have converted people. They would have worshiped with brethren. They would have baptized brethren. And then when Paul, or at that time Saul, had started that persecution, they would have known and been intimately close with some of the brethren and sisters that were killed during that persecution. They would have known the families that left, perhaps had even converted some of those families themselves that had to flee for their lives and get out of there. And so as James is writing this is a very personal letter that's going to set the stage for what he's about to talk about, because James is going to be writing to comfort and give encouragement to people who had picked up and just left everything, had left their lives, left everything that they had known because of persecution. And so when James is going to get into talking about trials here in just a moment, as we're about to read, this is not some kind of a hypothetical in the future, if things come up in your life, count them as joy kind of a thing. James is intentionally going to be dealing with these type of issues because he's writing to a group of people that have suffered. He's writing to a group of people that had lost family members because of persecution and have undergone serious sacrifices and testing to really how much they believe in Jesus and how much they're willing to endure because of the faith. So any comments on that before we move on and transition, as James is going to, into verse 2 here? Yeah, Randy, go ahead.
And because of what you just said, BJ, and because of that, it's kind of interesting to see how he continues on with verse 2. They know that they're suffering trials. They know that they're being persecuted. They know where they're at. They know where they're not at anymore. And then he starts out, count it all joy. I mean, would this not be a letter that you would want to hear?
Right.
That one that starts out that way? The predicament that I'm in right now, James, one of the apostles back in Jerusalem, is telling us to count this all joy. I've got to listen to him. I've got to find out what he wants me to know about this. I think it's kind of interesting how he just grabs them right there and says, hey, I know what kind of condition you're in. I know you know the condition you're in, and here's why.
Right. Absolutely. Great thoughts, Randy. Anybody else who wants to chime in before we move into verse 2 here? Hi, Sandra.
Hi.
I saw you on here. I just wanted to say hi. I hadn't addressed you yet. Thanks for joining in tonight. I appreciate it.
Well, I'm not sure that I've done everything right yet.
You're doing great. All right. Do you want us to be able to see you? Because we just see your name right now. Okay, good. As long as we can hear you, you always got good things to say. Do you have anything to add before we move on to verse 2?
I think we need to remember that the Romans were in control, and a lot of the people who were Christian as well as Jews had been enslaved, and they had been moved to different areas away from their family and friends, and to some degree away from the church. But many were worshiping incognito. Right.
No, that's a very good point. And so there's a lot of suffering going on right now, not just because of the persecution that arose by Paul, but because of all the things that would have been going on because the Romans were in power at that time too. And that's a great point to bring up. Thank you, Sandra. Very good point. All right, well, let's read verse 2 and go down into verse 4. Randy, would you read that for us?
Sure. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing.
Count it joy when you meet trials of various kinds. Of course, in this instance, James is writing to some people who have faced some trials that we are very foreign to as Americans. But I think it's interesting here that James is going to cover and go into throughout this next section, these next few verses, these next 16 verses. He's going to go into various different ways that our faith is going to be tested. And so that's why he says various trials, because James here is setting up for several things that he's going to try to address here in the next few verses. He's going to talk about persecution. He's going to talk about temptation. He's going to talk about our need for wisdom. And so various trials is not merely one aspect of our life in which our faith is going to be tested. And I think sometimes we think like that. We think, one dimensionally, like when it comes to temptation, as long as I can overcome temptation to sin, then I have a genuine, real faith in God. But that might not be the case, because there's other areas and other ways that we are going to be tested, not just with the genuineness of our faith. And that's what James is going to be talking about here. And so those, as we've already said, he's writing to, they're not any kind of strangers at all to the idea of suffering or trials on account of their faith. They had been uprooted. They'd left all that they'd known on account of their faith. Perhaps they'd lost family members or friends on account of their faith. And so this is a very real thing that James is saying here. This is not some kind of a theoretical statement, which unfortunately, I think a lot of times this is how we read it as American Christians, because we have not suffered the way that many other Christians suffer in different parts of the world, or we do not suffer in many ways that Christians in the past in different cultures have suffered. And so we read this and we think, count it joy when you face trials of various kinds. And the worst thing we could maybe think of is like losing a job or something like that. Or what's going on with all this stuff in our country right now and COVID. This is not a hypothetical, theoretical situation in which in the future, if something happens, count it as joy. We'll ask what that means in a second. This was real stuff that had happened in their lives that James is addressing and is talking about and is encouraging them and telling them, in light of these very real struggles, to count what they've gone through and what they would go through as joy. And so let's just open up the floor for some discussion in our Zoom class here. And for those that are following along on Facebook, I am watching the feed here. If you've got comments or questions, please, do that here too. Why does James say this? Why does he say count it joy when you face trials of various kinds? And I'll just open it up for y'all to discuss at this point. Why does he say that? Be sure to unmute your microphone, by the way. If you're trying to make a comment, be sure to unmute your microphone. Randy, go ahead.
Well, there's a supporting verse over in Romans chapter 5. It kind of goes a little bit further. I mean, when you look at verse 3, James kind of gives us a hint there, knowing from what he just said in verse 2, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. And you turn over to Romans 5:3. Where Paul tells them, he said, not only that, but we also glory in tribulations, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance. Perseverance produces character. Character produces hope. And so when you put that together and you put the formula together, you see why it's important, and you see really why the joy is there, because your faith, when it is faced with trials and you're tested, then you can find the genuineness of that faith. You know who you are. You know if your faith is genuine. Right.
Absolutely. Charlie, you unmuted your microphone. What did you have to say?
Oh, I was just going to say that, when people have trials, they turn to God. It makes them think more about God and then think more about their lives and the full meaning of their life. There's just, when you don't have trials and everything's happy and good all the time, people tend to forget about God. And then you get caught up in the, worrying about worldly things, and you don't have that joy. So without trials, sometimes you take it for granted.
Right. No, I believe that that's absolutely correct. And there's a lot of passages that are very similar to Romans 5 that Randy cited. Hebrews 12 deals with this at length, starting in verse 3, and the Hebrew writer talks about that you have not, even gotten to the point on account of your faith that you have resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And then it's going to go into talking about discipline, which is really used in the same kind of way that is meant to talk about, trials, and that these things that we go through are intended to produce a result. And that's what the Hebrew writer says. He says, no discipline seems enjoyable at the time, but painful. But later on, however, it yields the fruit of peace and righteousness by those who have been trained by it. And that's what James is getting at here. He's not saying that you're going to be happy as you go through these things. I do not believe that there is this teaching in the scriptures that teaches that Christians, must be happy at all times. I've met people who believe something like that, and yet ironically don't believe it of themselves. They don't live it, because there's going to be times that are really, really, really difficult as Christians. There's going to be things that we go through that are so hard that we must endure. And in the moment, they're very difficult. But they're producing something within us. They're bringing something about within us that we can count as joy. And Peter writes it this way in his first letter, that is so similar. I was talking to Kylie about this before this class started. I said, I really wonder if James and Peter sat down in Jerusalem and said, we need to write an encouragement letter to those who have been dispersed and those who have been scattered because of this persecution. And they kind of came up with a rough outline together and then wrote their own words and sent it out. Because when you overlay James and First Peter together, they're very, very similar in how they begin and the points that they bring up. And Peter, in talking about the dispersion, says in verse 6, he says, you rejoice in this, that though for a short time you have been distressed by various trials, that the genuineness of your faith, more valuable than gold, which perishes though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And that's the same message that is being shared. Scott Vivquin joins us on Facebook, and Scott says the following. He says, joy comes because when we suffer for righteousness' sake, it shows that we belong to Christ. What a great thought. And what a great encouragement for us too. Thank you, Scott, for sharing that with us. That's absolutely right. And going back to our text in James, that's exactly what he goes on to say is that through this steadfastness, that as we suffer and as we grow, the things that we learn will make us stronger. And as time goes on, we become stronger. And as such, because we become stronger, we recognize that we are being made more into the image of Christ, and we're reminded of who we belong to. My dad joins in from Oregon. He's joining us for our Zoom study tonight. And he says, trials are like developing a callus. Your hand is actually stronger for work after the painful blisters. Your faith will also become stronger with trials. Although painful, you will be better off spiritually. That's a great illustration. Another great thought. Something else to think about is anything that has any value or worth is going to be tested. Think about like a mechanic for a moment. A mechanic doesn't test scrap metal because it's just scrap metal. But they do test the things that matter, the parts that are going on the car and that are going to function and have a great value to something. And I think it's important for us to remember that as well, because we recognize that the reason we are being tested and the reason we are going to undergo trials is because of the value that we have in Christ and because it's going to be worth it. While a dead faith is one that does not work, a dead faith is one that also does not withstand trials. And that goes back to the parable of the sower, right? It's the seed that was sown and was really excited and took, started to grow immediately, but it was choked by the things that are around it. Or the seed that couldn't take root because of the storms, and it was not able to grow as it should have. And that is exactly what's taking place here too. James is starting to key in on this concept already of living faith versus dead faith. And a living faith is going to be one that withstands through trials. A dead faith is going to be one that gives up because it's difficult and because it's hard. All right, thoughts on this? Any questions or comments? Great comments so far. Really appreciate the participation from everybody. But what other things do you guys have or want to flesh out in this section before we move on to verses 5 through 8 here? Randy, you got something?
Well, just another thought. Listen to what your dad's comment there made me also think that trials are kind of like the growth rings on a tree. They just add layer and layer of toughness, to that tree as it grows and so forth. And if you think of, the opposite of this, none of us really wants to stand in judgment day and find out that we have a dead faith. We want to be on judgment day with tested faith opportunities, not untested, because if I have a dead faith, I want to know that before I have no longer the opportunity to change. And so that's the benefit I think that God gives us, that as we face trials in this life, it gives us the opportunities to see just exactly what I'm made of. Because if I face those trials and I'm victorious over them, then I'm tougher the next time.
Yeah, and it gives us a reality check on where we're at and where we need to go. That's
exactly.
good.
Yeah.
Mike, you and Diane unmuted your mic. Have you got something to share?
Yeah, what I often think about with this is the same idea of, as we grow up and things are such a big deal when we're younger, and then we look back 5 years later and it's like that wasn't even really hard or difficult or a trial, but in the moment, in the time, it seemed like such a big deal.
Right.
And it's the same thing with our faith. If we go untested or unchallenged, we could have something very small wreck our lives. Whereas the older we get, the more our faith is tested. What we're able to do is to look back and to see, hey, I've overcome a bunch of these other things. This next trial, this next hurdle, this next problem is no big deal because of look how far I've come.
Right.
So that trying of our faith, whether we talk about producing calluses, whether we talk about building muscle, like going to the gym, it's all the same. That what we're trying to do is strengthen that faith muscle or that faith reaction to where we've got plenty of it when it comes time to need to use it.
Right. Absolutely. As you were saying that, Mike, I was thinking about, when Kylie and I first got married, we got introduced really, really early in our marriage to the fact that marriage is hard and that marriage is not Hollywood. And we went through some really, really tough spots right off the bat. And what it taught us, though, because we got through it and we started recognizing, hey, if we can get through this and come out better for it and our marriage stronger for it, we can get through anything that comes our way in the future. And I imagine that perhaps it's an encouragement to hear someone like James, writing to these people who have gone through this and telling them, guys, you've already made it this far. Look at what you've done. You were dispersed. Like you left everything. You went through this persecution and you're still faithful. You're growing. You're stronger for it. And if you could handle that, you can handle anything else that's going to come your way in the future here. That's a great thought, Mike. I really appreciate you sharing that. Thank you. Charlie, you unmuted yourself, you and Jana. Anything else?
I was just thinking that two things. We recognize this in so many things. In sports, we really tell people the value of the hard practice and all that kind of stuff. In business and work, nothing that's worth having, it comes easy. If it comes easy, it's really not worth having. So we recognize that in all other walks. And then secondly is to think about this and try to nurture this attitude, which is not easy, but if we can try to nurture this perspective before we fall into temptation, have that perspective when you're facing the temptation, so you don't get so disenchanted and so angry and so disillusioned but think about it before the moment. If you can nurture and try to, I guess, develop this attitude, because it's kind of an attitude toward life.
Right. Absolutely. Great thoughts, guys. Anything else that anyone wants to share before we move on? Sandra, have you got something? I guess not. It highlighted her for a second. I thought she had spoken up there. Well, Charlie, that's a great segue into verse 5-8, though, because James is constructing an argument and is constructing his chapter, his words very carefully here. And so he's not just going to be jumping around, which is how some people view, the first chapter of James, that he deals with trials, then he jumps around to something else, and then he comes back to trials. This is all going to be dealing with testing. And so where he just has discussed testing by trials here in verses 2-4, now he's going to shift his focus, because he's going to talk about how testing requires wisdom, and that if we're going to handle these things appropriately, that we're going to need God's wisdom in order to get through this stronger, like we should. Because if we try to handle these things with worldly wisdom, then we're not going to make it, right? We're not going to be stronger for these things. We're going to crash and burn. We're going to be worse for these things. And so he's going to go on to this next section, and starting in verse 5, and he'll say the following. He'll say, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith without any doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He's a double-minded man, unstable in all of his ways. So let's talk about this here. Jack Hafer, who I preached with in Salem, Oregon, always used this expression. He said, this is a freebie, right? This is a freebie given by God, that God generously wants to give us wisdom and wants to give us good things. This should take us down to verse 17, and it will connect it in later on in this context, and it will also actually connect it with verse 12. But every good and perfect gift is from above. And of those perfect and good gifts is the wisdom that God freely offers to give to us. And so if we just read this, we were talking about testing, and now here we're talking about wisdom. Let's just toss this around and ask this question, and we can toss this around on our Zoom here and on Facebook with the comments. How does this fit into the context of what James is talking about? To go from talking about testing and trials, and in a minute he's going to be talking about temptation. Why does James then take an aside and talk about, if any of you lacks wisdom, ask God, and God gives it liberally and generously and wants to give you that wisdom? What do you guys think fit into the context of what we're talking about here? And maybe another question to be thinking about that'll help us answer this question is this question. Not only why is James talking about this now? How does this fit the context? But maybe it would help us to answer the question, how does God give wisdom in the first place? Or where does wisdom come from? Charlie, Jana, what do you guys got?
Oh, well, your first question, my commentary says the wisdom God gives is not necessarily information on how to get out of trouble, but rather insight on how to learn from one's difficulties. I thought that was interesting.
So not necessarily, it fits the context by not saying, hey, if you listen to God, you won't have problems, because that's not true. These were people that were faithful Christians, and they had a lot of problems. So James, if I'm understanding that correctly, James is saying, here's wisdom to learn how to properly deal with those problems.
Mm-hmm.
That's very good.
I think the thing that sticks out to me is in verse 5, you're required to ask to get wisdom. And that means you have to have a certain level of self-understanding to know that that's your need.
Mm.
You don't just get it. You have to know you need it and ask for it.
That's a great point, Deb. And for those of you that are tuning in on Facebook and with us, that's Deb Johnson. And that is in stark contrast to what we read in passages like Proverbs chapter 3, which would say to trust in the Lord with all of our heart and not lean on our own understanding, right? Because that's how I think a lot of times this happens is we go through issues and we think we know how to handle it right. We think we know, better ourselves. We don't recognize our great need for God's wisdom. We don't recognize our great need for going to God to figure out how to handle this properly, because we think we have an understanding of how to do it. And when we do that, we end up crashing and burning. We end up not doing things the way that we ought to. But we need to recognize true wisdom, true knowledge, those come from God, right? And that's also Proverbs 1:7 and Proverbs 9:10. It's bookended that way, that the beginning of the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That if the emphasis here is on God as a source of wisdom, as the only source of wisdom, not any other source, but as you go through these things, that you must seek and turn to God to help us through these moments and help us through these times. But it begins with a recognition of how desperate you are for that wisdom. I think that's absolutely right. Still in Proverbs, when you look at chapter 1, verse 20, and following, there's this contrast between wisdom being free and crying out in the streets and calling out for you to accept her, and yet people didn't want it. People rejected it. People didn't hear what wisdom had to say until it was too late. And that's what James is trying to avoid here. He says, you seek it out now. You seek God and his wisdom out now before it's too late. And so that's great. That's great thought, Deb. I appreciate you chiming in and saying that. That's really good. Any other comments to piggyback off of what Deb was saying there? I thought that was very well said, well stated. Yeah, Randy, make sure to, there you go.
There we go. Yeah, thinking about what Debbie is saying there too. Someone, I don't know, I can't remember who said this, but someone said that one of the purest manifestations of arrogance is a failure to pray. And when you do this, you realize, when we, James says, when you ask him and he'll provide for you, that's an acknowledgement that I can't do this myself. That's an acknowledgement in God. That's an acknowledgement of my trust in God, of his power, his ability, his willingness to answer my problems. And so that's where it starts.
Mm-hmm. And, on that note too, I'll ask this, Randy, when he says ask of God and he'll give it, freely, is this like a Solomon thing where you pray to God for wisdom and you wake up the next day and all of a sudden you have all sorts of knowledge that you'd never had before because God just put it in your mind overnight? Or how would this apply to someone who says, okay, Randy, I hear what you're saying. God is telling me this is a freebie that I can get wisdom. Now, how do I do it? I'm praying to God. I'm asking for wisdom. How do I get it?
Well, it'd be nice if it would happen that way, wouldn't it?
It would be. Just wake up the next day and know exactly what I need to do.
I think he goes on. I think he answers your question, BJ, in the next few verses when he starts talking about doubting and asking and so forth. I mean, we may not understand totally God's will in something. We may not know how he's going to answer that need for wisdom and so forth. But I don't think that's the point that James is trying to clarify here. The point that James, I think, is making is that you got to trust him. You trust that God has the power. God has the ability. You don't doubt that he can do it. We may not understand how it's going to play out, but that's not the point. I know that God, will see to whatever the best is for me. He's going to see me through it.
That's right. That's absolutely right. Charlie, what do you have to say?
BJ, I was thinking that there would be a distinction, I think, in knowledge and wisdom. And I think the promise here is the granting of wisdom. And I think God will give us opportunities to gain knowledge, but a lot of times that takes hard work and study and listening and hearing and, all those kind of things. And so
Right.
the wisdom would be, I think, an ability to apply that and get through these situations he's talking about without, me having my knowledge and my faith and all that. But again, I see a difference in knowledge and wisdom, I guess is all I'm saying.
Yeah.
I think
I think you're
words
right.
are exactly.
Yeah, I like what Scott said. Scott Vifquins on Facebook, and he brought something to our attention, and this is going to help clarify how I interpret this to be understood. Because Scott says wisdom comes from asking God, but we also must read and study the scriptures to get it. Jesus is how we understand about God. He's the perfect image of the Father. I need to learn about Jesus, to understand Jesus, to trust Jesus in what he's had to say. And so it has been clearly given to us to be able to open up the word and know the mind of God at any time and not have to guess what God's will is for me, but to know exactly what God's will is for me because of how he has communicated it through the Spirit is an incredible thing. And so when it talks about doubting here, I'll tell you how I always understood this growing up, and I just think it's just wrong. This is how I understood this growing up. Ask God for wisdom, but if you doubt that God will actually give it to you, then you're a double-minded man and you're completely a fool and your whole life is falling apart. And I always thought, man, that's pretty harsh, because there's been times where I'm, nervous about, does God really love me, or those doubts that we have in our mind, right? Am I that double-minded, unstable man? I don't think that's what James is saying. I think what James is saying is God has freely given us wisdom. And if you doubt God's wisdom, if you think, I don't think that's right, that where I know what God has given us, I know what God's will is, but I doubt God's wisdom. And I think that I've got a better understanding of this situation. I don't think any of us would ever say that out loud, like I doubt God. But I think there's a lot of times where we've doubted God. We have doubted God's wisdom. God's wisdom says, to love your enemy. And I think a lot of times we've doubted that. God's wisdom says, that we ought to forgive. And there's a lot of times where I've doubted that, whether that's the right answer or not, given a difficult circumstance I've gone through, to turn the other cheek or to pray for those who have persecuted me. I'm going through this difficult moment. God, I need wisdom. God speaks up and says, pray for those who are persecuting you. And I go, I don't know if that's what I need right now. And so I think that's what James is getting at here. And if we listen to God's wisdom, we ask God for wisdom, and then we reject his wisdom, he says, you're like a double-minded man. It's like the young man who comes to his parents because he wants to hear his opinion coming out of their mouth, right? He goes to them for advice, but does he take their advice? No. I mean, most of the time, a teenage boy doesn't take his parents' advice. He pretends like he's trying to come to someone for advice, and that might drive people nuts. We all know someone like that who always comes to you for advice, and you always leave wondering why, because they never listen to anything you ever have to say. I think that's what James is getting at here. Don't ask God for wisdom and then turn around and not listen to what God has to say. That's like a double-minded man. That's just foolish. Why would you go to God and ask for help and ask for wisdom through this experience if you're not going to trust him enough to do what God has said? That's my take on this. That's my interpretation of this passage. It's very different from how I always understood it, but I think it fits the context a lot more, and I think it helps me understand what James is really trying to get at here a lot more. Randy, you unmuted your mic. What do you got there?
Oh, just a silly little comment, I guess, BJ. It's like praying for rain, but then leave your umbrella at home.
I love that. That's not a silly comment. That's a great illustration. I love that. Well, very good. Does anyone else have anything to add to this before we're actually out of time technically. So I'll ask you guys what you want to do. We still have quite a bit of material to work through. Do we want to save this for next Wednesday, Randy and Charlie, or do we want to just keep on going and go an hour and 15 minutes here? What do you guys think?
You might get two different answers, BJ.
All right, you guys on three. 1, 2, 3.
Well, look, I would, my recommendation is to stick with what we said, because I think we can talk this up even more, BJ. This has been a really good initial trial, and
Okay.
I think even more we'll go in and it'll be easy to get folks caught back up.
Okay.
And let's continue from there. That's my suggestion. But
Okay.
Randy made a different opinion on that and different suggestion.
Yeah, I think I don't want to take advantage of folks, the time and so forth. I think we could just maybe stick with the script. We can pick this up again next week, and
Okay.
I just don't want to take people's liberties.
Okay. All right. Well, what we're going to do then is we're going to go ahead and pause our study. We are at the 45-minute mark, and that's about what we want to keep this at. And we will just pick up exactly where we left off. And for those of you that are wondering where we're going with this study, we are dealing with the book of James, for those that have tuned in late or were not here at the beginning. And James is focusing on living faith versus dead faith. And a lot of what James is going to be writing about is how living faith is lived out and what living faith actually looks like. And this first part of his book is dealing with living faith as it regards the way that we're going to be tested. And so we talked about trials tonight. We talked about the group of people whom James was writing to. We discussed our need to go to God for wisdom to understand how to work through the different various kinds of trials that we are going to engage in and undergo in this life. And so where we want to pick up next time is we're going to pick up in verse 9, because one of the other ways that our faith is going to be tested is by distraction. And there's going to be ways in which we are going to be challenged what we're actually focusing on. And so that's what James is going to pick up next in verses 9 through 11. And then he's going to finish this chapter by talking about testing in regards to temptation. And so we'll have a lot to discuss next Wednesday night. For those of you that have been following along on Facebook, we really appreciate the comments. I see all of those. And for those of you who will be watching this later on YouTube, I will have this uploaded as soon as possible. And hopefully, I think we found a solution going forward into next week where we will be able to live stream simultaneously to Facebook and YouTube. Don't hold me to that yet, but I think we figured out a way. And so I will keep you posted on that. Harold, good to see you. Thanks for joining in on our Facebook feed here. Appreciate you. Thank you, everyone who joined us on Zoom today. You guys are awesome. And don't be afraid to unmute your mic and comment in the future, especially you Cooper girls. You guys just ran the whole show tonight. You're so loud. But and Chuck too. Chuck, thanks for jumping on tonight. Charlie, Randy, you guys have anything else for everyone?
I don't, BJ.
Say thanks,
Good job.
BJ. I'm looking forward. Yeah, good job.
Okay.
Looking forward to learning from everybody. Moving
Okay,
forward.
good deal. Thank you guys. All these meetings in the future will not be password protected, so anyone can join in and anyone can view it, and that's the way it should be. We're just opening up God's word together. The more people, the better. So thank you guys for jumping in and being a part of our study with us tonight. Love you very much. We're going to go ahead and end the live stream. Those of you who are on Zoom here,